It's a moment that, for all the wrong reasons, is practically iconic in modern video game discourse. After a fairly standard win in a seemingly run-of-the-mill week of Hearthstone's seasonal Grand Masters tournament series, pro player Blitzchung is to give his customary post-match interview to the match's commentators, and he does this instead.
都不要聊了，然后你随时可以开始，头先低下来。
光复香港，时代革命。
His words here roughly translate to "Liberate Hong Kong, the revolution of our times," a clear call of protest against the controversial 2019 Hong Kong extradition bill, which would have seen censorship-loving and human rights-violating communist China expand their control over Hong Kong, which is geographically part of the Chinese mainland, but is supposed to be an autonomous, special administrative region with its own laws and infrastructure. The aftermath is well documented. For making a political statement on broadcast, Activision Blizzard punished Blitzchung by revoking all of his prize money from that season of Grand Masters, which was reportedly around $3,000, banned him from Grand Masters, and suspended him from competition as a whole for a year. The commentators at the time, who practically coiled up in panic and hid under their desks, laughing in nervous fear of the ramifications of what had just happened, were fired. The footage I've been showing you so far has largely been of a different match Blitzchung played against Dawn, the opponent he defeated before his statement of protest, because the VOD of the original match was deleted almost as soon as it was over. The internet and the gaming community as a whole were in uproar over Blizzard's response. Many took to boycotting Activision Blizzard's games, protests were held at their offices, former Blizzard president and blind barber victim J. Allen Brack farted out a vaguely apologetic statement in which he managed to not really say anything of interest, and the literal US Congress got involved and condemned their actions. At the time, I was an occasional viewer of Hearthstone Grandmasters, and while I've never played competitively myself, I was at least tuned into the community at large. A lot of prominent community members had things to say about all this, but two in particular have stuck with me. Long-time Hearthstone commentator and on-screen personality That's Admirable stepped down from the Hearthstone broadcast team. He was, as far as I can tell, and please educate me if I'm missing someone here, the only commentator of about 6 or 7 who were consistently casting Hearthstone Grandmasters, which happened 3 days a week every week for 2 multi-month-long seasons a year, to do this. He had been a hugely visible presence in Hearthstone's competitive scene for literal years. He was in skits on their YouTube channels and streams, and was one of the game's foremost ambassadors. In speaking out in favour of Blitzchung's protest, he left behind all the financial security that came with a job he'd been doing pretty much since Hearthstone came out half a decade earlier. It has to have been incredibly scary for him. Jobs like esports caster aren't exactly easy to find. Hearthstone had been his home for 5 years, and this likely meant he'd have to learn a whole new game inside and out and immerse himself completely in its community to even have a chance of landing a similar job. He put it all on the line anyway, just to speak out for someone's freedom. I don't think he's been given anywhere near enough credit for this, and though he may be an American, he has my immense respect. The other statement I'm referring to came from Brian Kibler, an ex-Hearthstone commentator and Magic the Gathering Hall of Famer, who still did the occasional casting or on-screen presenting gig for Hearthstone esports here and there, but had otherwise settled into a career as a full-time streamer. Brian Kibler is someone I've been watching and following for a long time now and have a lot of parasocial respect for, and knowing the internet in recent years, I dread the day that it comes out that he set an orphanage on fire or thinks Dragon Ball Z is good. In his statement on the Blitzchung controversy, Kibler praises Blitzchung for his bravery and pulls out of his commitment to commentate the Hearthstone Grandmasters finals later that year at BlizzCon. In this statement, however, he also makes a very interesting point I want to bring up to highlight the complexity of this whole situation. Kibler acknowledges that he is not someone who shies away from politics, having often voiced his revulsion at the state of America under the Trump administration on social media. However, an on-screen esports broadcast is very different, and as he says in his statement, when on broadcast he may make a snide remark here and there, but recognises that he is representing Activision Blizzard and leaves those views at home. If he were to close a show with a speech about how Trump should be impeached, he wouldn't expect to be invited back. Suffice to say, I agree with a lot of what Kibler said here, because if I stand up after winning the 2023 Pokemon World Championships by pushing Knockoff with Incineroar 18 times in a row and shout, "The UK Conservative Party are cringe, I can eat my whole balls," based and objectively correct as I may be, me, I also shouldn't expect to be invited back. Some people complain when I make political jokes in my videos, but I don't have to care what they think because this is my channel. The only person involved is me, and I can say and do whatever I want on it. When corporations and advertisers and shareholders are involved, it's different, and you should expect some ramifications. The problem I had with Blizzard's response to the Blitzchung controversy, and the problem I suspect many had, was twofold. One, the punishment was entirely too severe. Banning Blitzchung from Grandmasters, suspending him from competition as a whole for a year, and taking away all of his prize money was outright draconian. Two, the severity of this punishment suggested where Activision Blizzard's priorities really lied, and outed them as yet another hypocritical company. They claimed that every voice matters and all this other corporate nonsense, and then they actively silenced and brutalized a player's livelihood the moment he spoke out in favor of human rights and freedoms. Not only that, but the wording on the ruling Blizzard used to justify their punishment is very vague. Blitzchung's protest apparently violated the rule that denounces engaging in any act that, in Blizzard's sole discretion, brings you into public disrepute, offends a portion or group of the public, or otherwise damages Blizzard's image. The in Blizzard's sole discretion part is the worrying part there. It basically means that hypothetically they can just ban or fine you for anything they deem as damaging or offensive. And this should highlight the moving parts involved in situations like this, because I don't really know how else you could or should word this, yet I don't fundamentally disagree with there being at least some kind of consequence for using your platform at a gaming event to make a political statement. The problem with rules like this is that they don't, and seemingly can't, take cultural context into account. Lots of geopolitical controversies like this are very morally complex. This one is not. We'll have some more fun discussion about the current state of the Chinese ruling bloc later, but for now, I'll keep it simple. The modern Chinese government is not poggers. Do 5 minutes of research into their relationship with Uyghur Muslims, their rampant censorship and human rights violations, or any of the further Hong Kong and Taiwan stuff we're going to cover later, and it's not hard to see they're the bad guys right now. Billion-dollar companies need to, but will never learn that you don't have to be apolitical to avoid mass political controversies. You could always just side with the good guys. This isn't a guy spraying Third Reich for life into a wall with his submachine gun at a PUBG tournament. This is someone saying, yeah, actually, I think human rights are pretty cool. China's current behaviour on the world stage is a rare case of something so insidious that even Republicans and Democrats, conservatives and liberals are united in condemning it and wanting to stand up to it. The only people who defend the Chinese government's actions in the modern day are the Chinese government and big Chinese business themselves, the ones who stand to gain politically and financially from it. And I suppose therein lies the problem, eh? The ones with all the power, those who trade in human decency for power, then roll down scumbag hill like a suit-wearing snowball, forcing everyone else to get out of the way or learn to live around the eventual avalanche. After all the public pressure and worldwide condemnation, Blizzard would eventually reduce Blitzchung's punishment. They'd reinstate him into Hearthstone Grandmasters, cut his suspension in half to 6 months, and crucially for me, return his prize money. There are some gaming companies, particularly smaller ones, who may very well have stood by Blitzchung's actions, or at least not punished him for what he did. So why was Blizzard's initial response so harsh? Why were they so defensive over criticism of the modern Chinese regime being shown on their broadcast? Well, it's all down to a good old bit of corporate intervention in video games, baby. Dudes in suits sticking their snoots in games where you shoot or collect boxes of loot. It has been a while since I made a video like this, almost 2 years in fact, because to be honest with you, with a couple of exceptions, I don't really like the modern video essay. Kind of feels like everyone's doing it, most of them feel forced and like they're just inflating something's importance for the sake of content, you know, making up opinions that they don't even really believe and just projecting themes and meaning onto things that just aren't really there, and most of the time taking like 3 hours to do it. However, in my time away from this long form stuff, I have developed a genuine and passionate interest in some topics that might necessitate a video like this, and will hopefully result in some essay style stuff that feels natural and real. As a long-time Hearthstone player and enjoyer, some of the morbidly fascinating ways that Activision Blizzard's relationship with a certain Chinese company have affected the game piqued my interest first and foremost. I'll admit, Hearthstone is definitely the primary focus of this video because I'm very familiar with it and because I find the corporate affairs and geopolitics and whatnot that surround it so fascinating. Originally, this video was going to be called Hearthstone and Corporate Intervention in Video Games. Unfortunately, due to corporate intervention in my life, it's far more fiscally responsible for me to take the Hearthstone out of the title so as to not alienate a wider audience who might be turned off at the prospect of a video so focused on this one game. Sorry, you're here now, like and subscribe. Don't blame me, blame capitalism. I can at least promise you a bit of League of Legends and Nintendo and some other stuff in here as well. Considering that only the first section of this video has passed and we've already delved into the US Congress actively condemning the actions of a video game company and the current political state of China, you can bet that this is a hell of a rabbit hole we are about to go down. So grab the nearest carrot and do something else that rabbits do. Sit down? Do they sit down? They don't do anything. Let's dive in to corporate intervention in video games. So, to answer this prior question as to why Activision Blizzard's punishment of Blitzchung was so harsh, we first need to acquaint ourselves with Tencent. Tencent is a name you may have heard in passing in the game sphere, or maybe you're one of the savvy few who are more educated on their deeds. Tencent is a lot of things, so I'll make it easy on myself and quote Wikipedia here. Tencent is a Chinese multinational technology and entertainment conglomerate and holding company headquartered in Shenzhen. It is one of the highest grossing multimedia companies in the world based on revenue. It is also the largest company in the video game industry in the world based on its investments. Yeah, Tencent is the largest video game company in the world by some metrics, and so many people still don't know about it, or at least still don't know the extent of its reach. Tencent fully owns Riot Games, who made League of Legends, which is likely the most successful esport of all time. They have a 40% stake in Epic Games, who made Jill of the Jungle, and also Fortnite. And most crucially to our story, prior to Microsoft's buyout of Activision Blizzard, they also had a 5% stake in them too. They own Sumo Group, Turtle Rock Studios, they have a pretty sizable stake in From Software, they own so many things that you probably can't even keep track of it, and they only continue to grow at a genuinely alarming rate. To put it simply, Tencent are one cryogenically frozen Nazi away from being Chinese Disney. So now you know of the giant Chinese megacorporation with huge monetary influence over Activision Blizzard, I'm sure you see why someone protesting in favour of Hong Kong's freedoms on a live broadcast of theirs would scare them enough to do something so drastic. Because companies love to preach acceptance and equality right up until there's money involved. Blizzard insists that the severity of their punishment of Blitzchung was nothing to do with their ties to China, but as they also insist that every voice matters, we're not going to listen to them. The Blitzchung Incident was hardly the first case of Activision Blizzard chowing down on the Chinese regime's boot after all. For as long as I can remember, players going through Hearthstone's competitive system have been divided into 4 regions. You have the Americas, North America, Canada, Latin America and so on, Europe, self-explanatory, Asia Pacific and China. The former 3 regions all had their Grandmasters tournament seasons broadcast on the Hearthstone Esports YouTube channel. China did not. So you could actively watch players from these first 3 regions go through this grueling month-long gauntlet and eventually qualify for the World Championships. Usually, you'd find out which Chinese players had qualified through social media, having no idea who they were. This likely begs the question, why wasn't China's Grandmasters equivalent broadcast in any traditional sense, and why was it considered separate from the Asia Pacific region despite being the most populous country in Asia Pacific? Well, as far as I can see, Blizzard have never come out and told us why, but if I were a gambling man, and I used to play Hearthstone, so clearly I am, I'd wager it was something to do with some of the Asia Pacific Hearthstone players coming from a little place the casters would only ever refer to as Chinese Taipei. That might be what they call it, but you or I might know it as Taiwan. Let me just crack open another can of worms. Worms. games. I'm going to give you a surface level explanation here because, believe it or not, this video isn't actually supposed to be about modern Chinese geopolitics. Taiwan is an island off the coast of China. China have decided that they own it. They don't. In order to undermine Taiwan's sovereignty, China refused to acknowledge it as Taiwan and have instead taken to calling it Chinese Taipei. Taiwanese Hearthstone players are considered to be from Chinese Taipei, yet are put into the Asia-Pacific region so as to not clash with China, who haven't yet assimilated Taiwan like they so desperately want. Aside from all the obvious moral hang-ups with this, you also have to consider how unnecessarily poorly it reflects on the Chinese players themselves. Because of the oppressive nature of their regime, basically no one gets to watch them, learn who they are, or become endeared to them at all. And hardly anyone outside of their sphere is ever rooting for them in big matches, even though it's entirely feasible that they don't agree with the actions of their government either. And before you entertain the notion that all this censorship and division could be less about Tencent and more about Activision Blizzard and Hearthstone, let's talk about the aforementioned Riot Games, which Tencent owns in its entirety. Some controversy popped up not long ago at the 2019 League of Legends World Championships over the team Hong Kong Attitude, who were practically never referred to by their full name and consistently abbreviated by the commentators as simply HKA. Riot Games communication lead Ryan Rigney put out a mealy-mouthed statement on the caster's hesitance to just say Hong Kong, in which he effectively tried to deny that this was due to Chinese censorship, and as always, no one does or should believe this. Hell, we don't even have to stick with Tencent for examples of video games being censored to appease the Chinese ruling bloc. Taiwanese developer Red Candle Games had their critically lauded horror game Devotion removed from Steam for an Easter egg that mockingly compared Chinese President Xi Jinping to Winnie the Pooh, which is a comparison that is frequently used to mock the Chinese president and is something I would also do to the man who is trying to absorb me. The game was review bombed by Chinese accounts for this, and aside from being removed from Steam, was of course completely scrubbed from all online markets and social media sites in China. You'll struggle to find any mention of the game or its developer anywhere, and the game's visibility and sales have been hugely damaged by China's actions against it. Now, I've talked about China pretty much exclusively so far because with their current regime, it's very easy to find examples of them tampering with media. You can find a lot more examples of Tencent being weird and shady with no difficulty whatsoever, for example. However, I do have a point to make with this video, and that's going to require some light to be shed on how companies from countries all over the world are compromising the artistic integrity of this medium. So let's hop to it. But not before a word from this video's sponsor, me! Not long ago, I started a new series on this channel, the Lame Design Conference, wherein every edition me and my esteemed YouTube guest have to come up with a pitch for the worst, most unfathomably unfun video game possible as a professional artist and illustrator speed paints our pitches over our inane explanations. Viewers can then vote on who won by making the worst video game. Let me tell you, I've had a lot of good ideas in my time, but I truly think this might be the best. It's great fun, and I really love the way it's all come together. However, I've had some commenters who were pleasantly surprised with what they found tell me they had no idea what the video was or could possibly be before they clicked on it, and that made them initially feel like staying away. So I thought I'd use this video that I figured was more new viewer friendly to advertise it. I'd love it if you went and checked it out. There's 2 episodes so far with more to come down the line. Here's a clip. I'm the guy who will make the Muppets RPG happen. It's time, baby! We've waited too long! This is my cross to bear. Don't worry. I've got it. The Muppets RPG. Hear me out, right? So, we'll start with some fun stuff before we get into the lame stuff. You know, I could sit here and go through, like, which character is which class all day and who is what, but I'll give you some quick fun examples. Kermit obviously makes sense as an all-rounder as your main character. He's probably got a sword. He can do a bit of magic and all that stuff. He can do a little bit of everything. You know, maybe he's a knight. Maybe he's like a general swordsman. Animal and Rolf as bards. This makes total sense. I think they're very different kinds of bards. Animal probably plays a sick drum solo and buffs everyone's damage and makes them do more damage and stuff. Rolf probably plays a soothing jazz piano solo and maybe heals some of the party, maybe increases some of their evasiveness and whatnot. My personal favourite here, Beaker and Dr. Bunsen Honeydew, are a 2-in-1 character, kind of the Kate Sith of this game, if you will. For the Final Fantasy VII fans, they're mages because in this medieval time, you know, science was magic. And it says here, for their ultimate attack, they present the concept of atheism, stunning their opponents. Cheesy, I would like to formally request an image of Beaker and Dr. Bunsen Honeydew presenting the concept that God might not exist to a bunch of generic RPG enemies, please. Activision Blizzard have been somewhat of a common denominator in all that we've talked about so far, unable to escape controversy even after the Blitzchung Incident for their treatment of women and people of colour and basically everyone who works for them. Their problematic behaviour has continued despite balding Old English sheepdog Animorph and Blizzard Vice President J. Allen Brack stepping down from the company. So who's really responsible for fostering this culture of chaos and inequality? Well, it seems increasingly likely that it's down to this guy. No, it's not the fabled 4th Rice Krispies elf. It's Bobby Kotick, who's been CEO of Activision since the 90s and has refused to step down despite all the controversy that has spiraled around the company under his leadership and apparently threatening to kill one of his assistants. Reports suggest that Bobby Kotick's board of directors is stacked with a bunch of rich yes-man buddies of his, and he may only be convinced to leave the company when he's offered a golden parachute, i.e. a big sum of money to land safely with as a result of the merger with Microsoft. Under his guidance in the last few years, the company's reputation and critical success has absolutely plummeted. This is a man who clearly cares about money and money only. Perhaps you heard about Diablo Immortal, a microtransaction-ridden mess of a game that was lampooned by fans the day it was announced, a game in which you could literally spend $5,000 on what was basically a loot box and receive nothing of value.
I spent $10,000 and got nothing!
Supposedly, this game was designed with the Chinese audience in mind, as Western and Nintendo video game consoles are prohibited in China, causing most to rely on mobile games for their entertainment and develop Stockholm Syndrome for microtransactions and daily quests. Perhaps you've heard about Overwatch 2! You haven't heard about Overwatch 2 because they've fumbled the bag with that one beyond belief. But for our most compelling case of corporate cash actively hindering a game, we need to go back to Hearthstone one last time. Up until about 2018, during the days of Hearthstone's HCT, or Hearthstone Championship Tour, viewership on Twitch for big events, particularly the World Championship, was in the tens of thousands. The game was thriving, sponsorship opportunities for the events and more importantly the players were rife. The visibility afforded upward mobility for everyone involved at every level of production. Then, Activision Blizzard signed a streaming exclusivity deal with YouTube, who presumably offered them more, and their events would no longer be streamed on Twitch, and thus begins the downfall. I have no in-depth understanding of what this meant for the likes of Call of Duty and Overwatch, but I haven't heard good things. What I can tell you is that pretty much every imaginable metric for Hearthstone has been down dramatically since. Hell, if you don't play Hearthstone, you probably have no idea what it's been up to for the past 5 years. You've probably just not heard about it at all. More than anything, I feel for the players and commentators here, who, because of the money-grubbing decisions made by their corporate overlords, now have a much harder time building big followings, getting streaming careers off the ground, and organising deals with sponsors and teams. For the past few years, the grueling Hearthstone Grand Masters has been played in front of, maybe 5,000 viewers max? The World Championships in 2021 on YouTube had record low peak viewership of 23,500 viewers. The World Championships in 2017, 4 years earlier on Twitch, peaked at over 135,000 viewers. That's how far the game's viewership has fallen. It doesn't help that Grandmasters is an arduous system for players, with many long-time legends of the game dropping out of it, citing burnout, low pay, and generally better opportunities afforded to them by just trying to strike out on their own and stream. As I say, my knowledge of Overwatch is limited, but from general discourse and having a few friends who played it, I get the impression that this game is much the same. A promising IP with a burgeoning ecosystem that was drained of all of its life by corporate greed and negligence. Of course, in attempting to show the corporate intervention of companies that aren't just sucking up to China, I could turn to the absolute goldmine that is EA. All of the controversy surrounding their loot boxes and monetization is so well documented that I don't even feel the need to touch on it here. Seriously, look up any combination of the words EA, Star Wars Battlefront, and microtransactions and you'll be up to your eyeballs. Ubisoft have been putting money over art since long before Tencent acquired a 5% stake in them, and continue to do so with Ubisoft Quartz, which is a platform where you can buy Ubisoft NFTs, only with a different name and you can apparently show them off in some games. Oh, I'm so tired. And it's hardly just Western companies either. Square Enix have frequently expressed their interest in NFTs and the blockchain because that will make them money, and who cares about the environment or the cultural consequences of financially speculating on art. Sony purchased fighting game tournament monolith Evo recently, and suddenly the Super Smash Bros. Series, Nintendo developed fighting games, are no longer featured at the biggest fighting game tournament of the year, despite Melee previously having been a staple for around a decade. And while we're on the topic, let's touch on Nintendo, shall we? I'm not going to go in depth on all of their transgressions because I did that in a video in 2020 that I think still holds up perfectly well, but there's this one comment I still get all the time on that video that bothers me to no end. It's droves of people saying something to the effect of, "Man, Nintendo really went downhill when Iwata died and Reggie left." If this is truly what you think, you are incredibly naive. No matter how charming and personable they may seem, no matter how much they endear themselves to you, business people are not your friends. They are in business to make money. I love what Nintendo make. I especially love what they made under Satoru Iwata, and I acknowledge and respect that as far as CEOs go, he was, by all accounts, a lot fairer and gentler and more willing to get his own hands dirty than most. He was still in charge while a vast majority of the fan game takedowns and anti-consumer decisions I discussed in that video were made. If you don't think he played a crucial role, if not the crucial role in those decisions, I want some of what you're smoking. The hero worship of Reggie Fils-Aimé is even more baffling to me. This is someone who was on the Game Awards board in 2016, so would have surely played a monumental role in the likes of Pokemon Uranium and another Metroid 2 remake being pulled from award contention that year, which is something people in the comments also seemed very up in arms about. He's also gone on record as saying that he's a big believer in the blockchain and play-to-earn technology, and thinks that Animal Crossing could make a good blockchain game. So maybe we should be glad that he's not there anymore? I really don't mean to slander these people, but if you're one of those people thinking that Nintendo went downhill once they were gone, then I think you have no understanding of big business and what it really is and how it works. It wasn't solely being held up by two guys. This is the way it's always been and always will be, save for a huge global cultural shift. Business people, like politicians, are not your friends, no matter how much they may endear themselves to you. Take these people off your pedestal. The Bernie Mittens meme was weird. He was just wearing mittens. Nintendo are a weird example compared to most of the companies I've talked about so far, because most of the companies I've talked about so far dealt in games as a service, which is something I'm going to come back to. They largely make high quality, one-time purchase games, but have weirdly conservative and authoritarian views on art and hate people expressing their love for their games in ways that they didn't actively encourage. Again, my video on the topic is 2 years old, but I think it all still holds up. They are an exception, but don't get it twisted, they absolutely are still all about the money, as much money as they may leave on the table. The idea that corporate machinations are affecting the artistry of video games surely isn't new to you, but what I hope is somewhat interesting is the way that it is now spreading to governments and politics. There are real cultural divides at play here. We Westerners may see the way Nintendo, for example, handles their properties and stamps out all fan iteration as bizarre and dictatorial. But I've often been told that iteration on another person's work is seen in a different light in Japanese culture. Not to generalize too much, but it can often be seen as less flattering and less expressive of someone's love for another's art, and more disrespectful, more trampling over someone's work, trying to show them how to do it better. And now's the moment you've all been waiting for. It's time for me to talk about Japanese wrestling. There's this fascinating cultural divide between the East and the West that can be beautifully demonstrated by comparing wrestling on both sides of the world. In Western wrestling, when a good guy, or face, goes to grab a chair to attack their opponent with, we cheer, because likely the bad guy, or heel, that he's wrestling is an irredeemable lowlife who's about to finally get the comeuppance they deserve. When the referee then takes that chair from the good guy and stops them from exacting revenge, we boo. We wanted to see the violence. We wanted to see justice dispensed. In Japanese wrestling, when the referee takes the chair away from the good guy, they cheer, or they clap respectfully, it's different there. Because the Japanese audience don't want to see their protagonist stoop to that level. They want to see them win without cheating or resorting to excessive violence. This is fascinating to me. This is not something I feel on a personal level. I would rather see the good guy get the chair and beat the tar out the bad guy, but it is something I understand. When I learn about cultural differences like this is often my reaction. I often find that I can't bring myself to feel the same way as people from another culture, but I can understand it. It makes total sense to me how this different reaction is one people would have, how a culture of people could come to the conclusion over time that this is how you should respond. It's not bad, it's just different. It's really interesting to me how these things form. So what's all this been for, eh? All their Japanese wrestling and NFTs and Rice Krispies elves? Well, I'm going to spend the next few minutes effectively saying a lot of stuff you've probably heard before, but I hope with all this context you've been gathering, and with all this information fresh in your mind, it might hit just a little bit different this time. It's easy to forget that in the grand scheme of things, video games are still a new medium. You can trace the roots of film and music and whatnot back through hundreds of years, but I'd argue video games only really began as a public medium when the first arcades started seeing success, or maybe when the first home consoles were released. So that gives us about 45 to 50 or so years. Because we live in a commercialized, productivity-heavy, largely capitalist world, that means that video games are gonna follow suit with all the other forms of media in time. First, corporations get involved, then governments get involved, then cultural divides form. With the way the world works right now, and has for a long time, as time goes on, as culture and technology progress, video games are only going to get further away from us. Because they're a way of making money, and thus they will be used to make money in ways we can't even predict, but it's fair to assume a lot of them will be invasive, divisive, and totally counter to art. And we all agree that video games are art, right? Despite what the boomers on the news will tell you, they're one of the highest forms of art out there, actually, because they're a combination of almost every artistic practice in one. But they're only going to become increasingly corporatized in time. That's just the way the world works right now. And in my opinion, the games as a service model is a great example of this. It's a proven business model. A way to make more money out of video games is to, instead of selling them as a single purchase, offer them for free. Let players experience it at a base level and be tantalized by all the possibilities, and then lock them out of progression or the full experience unless they pay. And then give them the opportunity to pay for a multitude of things and watch the money roll in over time. I don't mean to imply that all games as a service type games are evil and insidious. Multiverses is a pretty good recent example of this type of game with very fair and reasonable monetization, and pretty much the whole game is open to players without having to spend a single dime. But this model is certainly more subject to be predatory than a simple one-time purchase. This is one of the many ways corporations have and will continue to optimize the profit they can make out of what is supposed to be art. This is why, as much as I am completely baffled and often outright angered by Nintendo's decisions, I do at the very least respect them to an extent. Keeping in mind what I said earlier about Japanese wrestling and cultural differences, a large majority, but not all, of their decisions, misguided as I may believe them to be, are, in their minds, made to maintain the purity of their art. They are hugely about the money, like every company, but they are also still very invested in the sanctity of their creations, and while that often leads them to making some dumbfoundingly authoritarian and unfair decisions, I can at least respect that they still clearly care about their art. In a world with EA and Ubisoft and the like floating around, that matters. The Chinese government and Tencent is a whole different ballpark. Cultural differences be damned here, like, that's just comic book villainy. Knowing all this, there are two things you, as a video game enjoyer, because I can't say gamer unironically anymore, the internet has ruined me, can do to help video games retain their artfulness in a world that will increasingly use them as tools for financial and, yes, political gain. 1. Learn to separate the devs from the suits. This is one that should be obvious, but so many video game enjoyers somehow struggle with. Game devs are artists. They care about creation and creativity, Often, they are not the same people who get to make all the decisions. The Hearthstone dev team are a great example of this, a group of people who are open with fans on social media, stand up for good causes, and especially in recent years, have made a bevy of improvements to make their game as newcomer friendly as they possibly can. And as they possibly can is doing a lot of legwork here, because at the end of the day, their game is a service. It has to be able to make money in the long term. It's not a single purchase, and so when it comes to monetization, they often have to answer to the likes of Snap, Crackle and Pop's gassy uncle over here. They would have had nothing to do with what happened to Blitzchung. Many of them would have been hurt deeply by the toxic work culture of Activision Blizzard as a whole. Yet, as video games become increasingly commercialized and see more interference from suits and more business hierarchies develop, people still seem to struggle to tell the difference between the devs and the business people. Increasingly, you'll find that they are not the same. Nickelodeon All-Star Brawl was fundamentally a great game. It was trying to appeal to fans of platform fighters, and it was trying to be something that could be enjoyed in tournaments at high-level competition. Mechanically, in terms of pure gameplay and systems, it succeeded. It was made by Ludosity, makers of Slap City, a great team who are very experienced in the genre. Yet, the team have experienced derision and lampooning on social media constantly for the lack of voice acting when the game started, the lack of single-player content, the lack of certain characters, and the thing is, this is a Nickelodeon game. There's a whole corporate empire behind these IPs. The people who own these IPs are not the same people making the game. Whilst seemingly still unable to come out and say it, devs on Twitter have frequently hinted that they wanted to have all the stuff in the game that fans wanted, but corporate have not allowed them the time, budget, or resources. When you, as a game dev team, are hired by a larger company, you can have deadlines forced on you, you can have creative ideas shot down for arbitrary reasons, you can simply not be given the space to make the game you really want, and it sucks so much that the devs who tried everything they could to make the game the best it could be, and did a great job, by the way, are constantly catching strays from tribalist morons on social media about how the game is dead or whatever, because everything has to be a competition to them, and real people's hard work just isn't a thought in their empty little heads. If a game is forced out early or lacking something you wanted, it is almost never the dev's fault, but the fault of the company looming over them. I guess it's just harder to shout at something that doesn't have a face. And number 2, you can play games like this. It should go without saying, indie games inherently fly in the face of almost everything I've talked about today. They are games where the artists also get to be the decision makers. There is no pasty executive who's never engaged with real art in his life breathing down their necks, telling them how to make art and when to release their game, and that has made way for some absolutely beautiful works in the past few years, and as long as we continue to support them, should hopefully continue to do so for a long time. I knew a lot about Undertale before going in, and it still hit me, man. Like, I know it's almost cliche to talk about Undertale hitting you emotionally in this day and age, but I don't care. I literally knew who all the characters were and what the final bosses of each route were, and it's still, I don't know, what a real thing, you know, made by a real person with real emotion, huh? A AAA game has not hit me like that in a long time. Just talk about indie games, feature them in your videos if you're a content creator, buy them, mention them on social media, wishlist them on Steam. That's actually a huge one. It's really helpful for indie game devs for you to wishlist their games on Steam if you want them. They are the lifeblood of artistic integrity in the games industry, and they will continue to be as guys who only care about money get a firmer grip on video games the same way they did with music and TV and everything else. The best way you can support games as art and help maintain their artistic integrity is to buy and play games like this. Here are some recommendations right now. Slay the Spire is ruthlessly addictive. Gameplay wise, I think it might actually be perfect, or near perfect. I literally logged 7 hours in my first day. I'll never forget it. This game became a problem for me, and I mean that in the best way possible. Lisa the Painful is not for the faint of heart. It was the first game in a long time that I can remember making me feel genuinely uncomfortable. At the same time, it was also one of the funniest games I've played ever. There's a scene involving a bulldozer that anyone who's played the game should be thinking of right now. That scene actually needs to be put in a museum of some kind. I love any kind of art that can make me laugh and then also make me go, oh, and feel really uncomfortable within a short space of time. So if you don't mind referring to a walkthrough every so often, huge recommend. Owlboy, despite being a pixel art indie game on a presumably small budget, is in my top 5 most gorgeous games of all time. Seriously, look at this. Oh my god, real people made that. It's a super unique game with very original but still intuitive and inherently fun gameplay, charming characters, and it doesn't insist on itself at all. It all wraps up in a nice breezy 8 or so hours, so it's not even a particularly big commitment. However, I'm saving this final section of the video for my favourite indie game of all time, because not only do I want to talk about it and recommend it to you, but I also think with everything I've talked about so far in this video, it's very thematically appropriate. I hope that through the lens of talking about this game for a while, I can find another more profound point than the ones I've just made. I think this game has a message, and especially considering some of the things you may have heard or even learnt for the first time watching this whole video, I think it's a message worth spreading. Because there's this enduring debate about art, about whether it should be permanent or temporary, whether it should persist over time, or whether it's meant to be something you experience once in a particular moment and then go away. I don't really have a stance on this as far as something like fine art is concerned. Hanging a picture in your room that you like and that you look at and appreciate a lot, that has value, right? And that value isn't tarnished because that picture isn't attempting to be both art and a service. It's not trying to get money out of you over time from just existing in your room. While I don't think games as a service are inherently evil, I do dislike the model because it feels inherently cynical. Something that is never-endingly trying to get money out of you. Paintings don't do that. When you buy a Blu-ray, you own that movie, but the games as a service model never ends. It is always trying to get money out of you, and that, I think, is just counter to art. My favourite thing about Spiritfarer is that it ends. And I don't mean that as a backhanded compliment. When Spiritfarer ended, it was one of the most beautiful things I'd ever experienced. I haven't cried at any media in a long time, and I didn't cry here, but I came closer than I had in probably over a decade. The emotional crescendo that Spiritfarer ends on is not something I'd dare spoil for you, and something I'd beg you to not spoil for yourself, but I'll say this. It made me actively go upstairs when I was living with my mum, who's been dealing with debilitating health issues for years now, and check on her. Just see if she was okay. Spiritfarer is a game about endings, and it is made all the more beautiful for its countless endings. You manage a boat on which you will bring aboard many souls passing over to the afterlife. You will bond with them over time, help them achieve closure, and after getting attached to them, you will see them off and say goodbye to them forever. Though it may not be as cynical as a game as a service, something that's always bothered me about Animal Crossing, and especially with New Horizons, is that once you've talked to your fellow villagers enough, they stop being interesting. You've seen all their dialogue and behaviours before, you know what they're going to do, you know all that they can do. They stop being characters, and they just become walking piles of code. This is what makes Spiritfarer so genius. You get to know these people, cater to them, and enjoy life with them, and then they go away forever. It's heart-wrenching, and it's something you'll have to deal with countless times, but it's so beautiful and elegant in its execution every time. It is the fleeting nature of these moments that make them so special and memorable. I don't think video games, while obviously an art form, can be compared one-to-one to any other artistic medium out there. The temporary versus permanent debate may very well be very hard to get to grips with other mediums, but with video games, I have to admit a bias and say that I think I find it quite simple. MMOs and Animal Crossing and the like may be intended to be as permanent as video games can get, and while I find that quite cynical to an extent, I think they still have merit and value. I think it's really depressing how they can become a part of your routine, almost job-like in the way that they make you play them out of obligation, and not even because you're really enjoying them, and kind of stop you from going out and trying and experiencing new things. But at least they're not trying to suck money out of you while they do it. At least I think they have value as long-term escapism or social experiences. It's when a game tries to be permanent and get money out of you all the while that I think it risks ceasing to be art. It's just a marketing tool at that point, a money-making device. No matter how much well-intentioned devs may put passion into it, it's sadly corrupted at the roots by big business. Video games are sadly going to continue to go this way as more guys in suits get in on an increasingly profitable industry. That's why we have to protect experiences like Spiritfarer, the ones that are going to become increasingly rare and limited as time goes by, the ones clearly made by real people who have had real experiences with real stories to tell, the ones that actually make you feel something and give you things to remember. The consumer does not have as much power as we'd all like, but our power does manifest in ways that might not be immediately obvious. I really think that one of the best ways you can stand up to the black smoke and turning gears of industry, one of the best ways you can do your part in defying corporate intervention in video games, is to buy games like this. Hello! It's been a long time since I made a video like this, and as long as this, I would say that I'm possibly close to being as exhausted as I am kinda broke right now. I don't want to guilt you into this at all. I only want you to do this if you are genuinely able to, but I would love it if you could support me and my work over on Patreon. Times are tough right now, and Patreon is pretty much the only reason I am able to even scrape by paying for my rent, and has been for over a year now. Shoutouts to cost of living crises and incompetent British governments. There will be a link in the description that I'll also show on screen. Thank you so much in advance if you choose to do this. It truly is indescribable how much it means to me. And thank you also to the people who have already been doing so, those people whose names I'm about to show on screen right now. Hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll see you soon.